Paulina Shuvalova starts off this titled Tuesday game, which was actually submitted to our website, by the way, with e4, c5, knight f3, d6. We have a Sicilian defense on the board. White has a few popular directions here. The absolute main line is to strike in the center with d4, but another really trendy option is the Rossolimo variation with bishop b5 check. Bishop b5 check, going for the Rossolimo! This is super common at the GM level to avoid massive amounts of theory. Black has to block this check, and the most common ways are bishop d7 or developing one of the knights to c6 or d7. Knight d7. Move ahead keeps the pawn structure completely flexible. White doesn't have an immediate threat here, so a typical developing move like castling makes a lot of sense, or starting to support the center with c3. Castling, simple and solid. Now black usually wants to kick that annoying bishop away, often with a6, or they can just keep developing the kingside with knight f6. a6, immediately asking the bishop a question. White has a choice. You can chop the knight off on d7, or just slide the bishop back to e2 or d3 to keep the tension on the board. Bishop e2, Shuvalova says, "No thanks, I'll keep my bishop pair for now," and just tucks it away safely. Black develops the knight to f6. White plays pawn to d3, keeping things solid in the center. Pawn to e6, setting up a very flexible pawn structure. White pushes the pawn to a4. This is a nice little prophylactic move, grabbing some space on the queen side. Black responds with pawn to b6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop and challenge that long diagonal. White drops the knight back to d2, preparing to reposition and maybe support an eventual f4 push. Just developing the bishop to b7, keeping an eye on the center. Now pawn to f4. I like this. White pushing the pawn here shows that they have a good understanding of when to grab space and prepare a kingside push. Just developing the bishop to e7. King to h1, a classic waiting move that gets the king off a potentially dangerous diagonal. Black improves the queen to c7, keeping the tension. White plays the knight to c3, finalizing their minor piece development as we inch closer to the middle game. Black castles to safety. With both kings tucked away, we can officially say we've transitioned from the opening into the middle game. We can finally start looking at some central fireworks. White goes for it with pawn to g4. They took about 18 seconds here, which is an eternity in blitz, fully committing to a kingside pawn storm. It's a bold plan, but as we'll see, it might overextend their position down the line. Black strikes back in the center with pawn to d5. This is the perfect reaction to a flank attack. Just blow up the middle. White ignores the center and pushes pawn to g5, attacking the knight and threatening to just capture it on f6. The knight retreats to e8, simply dodging the threat of the pawn capture. White plays the knight to f3. They thought for 10 seconds here, but this allows black to completely change the dynamic of the game. Capturing the central pawn was necessary to keep the advantage. At this point, I think it would have been better to capture the pawn on d5. By missing this, white surrenders the center and gives black a massive initiative. Black brings the knight out to d6, eyeing the f5 square. White pushes the pawn to e5, kicking the piece again, with a direct threat to take the knight on d6. The knight jumps into f5, avoiding the capture and planting itself on a fantastic outpost. White slides the queen to e1. Black pushes pawn to b5, expanding on the queen side. They are dictating the pace of the game right now. White develops the bishop to d2, trying to hold things together. Black takes the pawn on a4. White plays the knight to d1. Pawn to a3. Black is just shoving this pawn down white's throat, creating major structural headaches. White has to take the pawn. Black pushes pawn to d4, locking up the center and starting to suffocate white's position. White plays the knight to f2. Pawn to c4. Black is just rolling these pawns forward to create a complete bind. Look at this space advantage. It is absolutely, completely overwhelming. White's pieces are just choking to death behind their own lines. White brings the knight to e4. Black pushes pawn to c3. This pawn is a massive wedge deep in white's territory, restricting everything and creating an immediate threat to just grab the bishop on d2. The bishop retreats to c1, dodging the capture. Just a sad, sad square for that piece, but there are no other options. Black brings the other knight to c5, putting pressure on e4 and threatening to capture the knight. White plays the knight to g3, neutralizing the threat to e4. They spent over 15 seconds trying to find a way out of this bind. Black plays bishop to d5. Bringing the rook to the center would have been even more crushing, so I think it would have been better to bring the rook to d8, but this is still perfectly fine. White takes the knight on f5, creating a direct threat to grab the bishop on e7. Let's look at a better variation. Better would have been white would slide the king away, and black bishop could take on f3, then white knight would take on f5. This would look much better. Okay, now let's get back to the game. Black recaptures with the pawn, stopping the threat against their bishop. White brings the queen to f2. Black plays the knight to e6. White pushes pawn to h4, trying to find some sort of counterplay on the king side. Black just says no, pushing pawn to h5 and challenging that king side structure. White takes the pawn en passant, setting up a threat to take on g7. This opens up lines, but as we will see, it actually helps Black's attack. Black recaptures with the pawn, dealing with the threat on g7, and now the g-file is completely open. White steps the king to h2, Black sidesteps their king to h8, clearly preparing to use that newly opened file for the rooks. Now wait, you might be wondering, why didn't they just chop off that knight on f3 here? Well, if they had taken, White would just recapture with their bishop from e2, instantly turning it into an absolute monster. So yeah, sliding the king over to h8 was definitely the smarter choice. White grabs the pawn on d4 with the knight, threatening to munch the knight on e6. Black slides the rook to g8, creating massive pressure on the g-file. This feels super logical to take the open file, but trading knights in the center first would have been even stronger. It would have been better to just trade knights on d4. White takes the knight on e6, with an obvious threat to capture the queen on c7. Black recaptures with the pawn, removing the threat to their queen. White brings the rook to g1, challenging the open file. They are planning a deep idea here. They want to bring the bishop to e3 to solidify the position, and if the rooks get traded on g1, they can recapture and keep fighting. Black takes the rook on g1, preventing White from playing the bishop to e3. This also sets up a nasty mating net. Black is threatening a brutal attack against the White king. White recaptures with the queen, which is necessary to stop that deadly threat on h1. Black plays rook to g8, immediately hitting the queen and reclaiming the file, threatening to just take the queen on g1. White drops the queen back to f1, getting out of the way of the rook. They also have a deep idea to play the bishop to e3 to shore up the defense. They spent 15 seconds here, but unfortunately cracked under the pressure. This makes White's position even harder to hold, as it leaves the king side vulnerable. A defensive move was desperately needed to keep the balance, and I think it would have been better to play the bishop to e3 right away. Black takes the pawn on h4 with the bishop, grabbing a key pawn and opening up lines. The idea now is to swing the queen to g7 and orchestrate a mating attack. They thought for 15 seconds here, but it actually throws away a huge part of the advantage. Bringing the other bishop to c5 would have locked down the diagonals perfectly and suffocated White entirely. Sometimes the most obvious captures are not the most clinical, and it would have been better to bring the bishop to c5. White plays bishop to e3, desperately trying to block the diagonal and solidify the position. They spent 6 seconds on this, but however you slice it, this is the final nail in the coffin. It completely ignores the immediate tactical threats around the king. I think it would have been better to retreat the other bishop to f3. The position is now completely lost. Bishop to g3 with check. A beautiful forcing move that completely shreds White's king safety. The king has to step to h3. Black plays queen to d8, and this is where the game ends. White is completely busted because there is no way to stop the queen from coming to h4 with a devastating checkmate. What a brutal display of positional dominance. I think this was a great example on why pawn tension and space advantages are so important. Once Black got those pawns rolling on the queen side, White was just suffocating the entire game. Let me know what you think of this masterpiece in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more recaps.